The fire was not supposed to be there. Space did not burn the way fire burned on a planet. It did not spread in orange waves or climb up walls. It moved in slow, silent blooms of white and blue through corridors that had no air left to feed it. It moved through chemical lines and fuel pockets, and it did not care what was in its way. It just moved. And it was moving very fast through the wreck of the Valthari warship that was slowly tearing itself apart 300 kilometers from nowhere. Marcus Vael watched it from the cockpit of his salvaged ship, and he did the math. The warship had been dead for 6 hours. Something had hit it hard from the inside. An engine failure maybe, or a weapons malfunction. The outer hull was cracked in 4 places, and the middle section was already starting to fold inward the way old metal did. When the pressure holding it together was gone, every other salvage crew in the corridor had already pulled back. He had listened to them on the open channel. Too dangerous. Not worth it. Nothing left alive in there anyway. Marcus checked his scanner again. There was one life sign. Deep in the ship, Section 7. Faint but steady. He sat with that information for 11 seconds. He counted them. Then he put on his suit. The docking was the hard part. The warship was rotating slowly in its docking. Ports were either destroyed or sealed, and Marcus had to cut his way in through a maintenance panel on the lower hull while his ship held position on autopilot and hoped nothing large drifted into it. He got inside with a long cutting torch and a kit on his back, and he moved fast because fast was the only way to move in a ship that was deciding to die. The corridors were dark. His helmet light cut a thin line through the smoke, and he followed. The scanner reading like a man following a thread through a black room. Twice the floor shifted under him, and he grabbed the wall and waited, and then kept moving. The fire was in the walls now. He could hear it even through the suit. A low, deep sound like the ship was breathing wrong. Section 7 was at the back of the ship. It took him 9 minutes to reach it. Later, he would not be able to explain how he got there that fast. His legs just moved. His hands just moved. Something in him that had been trained long ago in places much worse than this simply took over and did the work while the rest of him stayed calm. The escape pod bay in Section 7 had 6 pods. 5 of them were gone. Launched or destroyed. The 6th was still in its slot, and the launch mechanism had failed. The pod door had a small emergency viewport, and Marcus pressed his helmet against it and looked inside. There was a child. It was small. Maybe the size of a human child of 7 or 8 years. Its skin was dark blue and covered in faint lines of light that pulsed slowly like a dim lamp on low power. It had 4 fingers on each hand, and its ears were long and folded flat against its head, and its eyes were closed. It was lying on the floor of the pod, and it was not moving, but the scanner said it was alive, and that was enough. Marcus cut the pod door open in 4 minutes. The lock was fused, and the cutter was not designed for Valthari metal, but he pushed it hard, and it worked, and the door came free, and he caught the child before it slid out. It was lighter than he expected. He held it against his chest and checked its body the way he had checked hundreds of bodies before. No external bleeding. One arm was bent the wrong way, broken. Possible internal injury from the impact of whatever had hit the ship. The light patterns on its skin were very slow. Too slow, he moved. Running in a suit in a collapsing ship with a child in your arms was not something any manual covered. Marcus did it anyway. He took a different route back because the first one was already gone. A section of ceiling had come down across the corridor he had used. He went left, and then up through a service shaft, and then sideways through a cargo room that was half on fire and out. Through the hole he had cut in the hull, he got back to his ship with 4 minutes to spare before the warship's rear section finally gave up and tore free. He laid the child on his medical table and started working the arm he could set. The internal bleeding he found with his scanner, and it was not as bad as he feared. One cracked rib, pressing on something it should not press on. He stabilized it the way he had been taught. Human medicine on an alien body was always a guess, but the basics were the same. Stop the bleeding. Keep the airway open. Stabilize the broken things. Let the body do the rest. He worked for 40 minutes without stopping. When he finally sat back, the child was breathing steadily. The light patterns on its skin were moving faster now. Brighter. Marcus took that as a good sign. He wrapped it in the warmest thing he had, which was an old gray blanket that had been on his ship so long it no longer had a smell, and he made sure it was secure on the table, and then he went back to the cockpit. He was going to file a rescue report with the nearest station and figure out where to take the child. That was the plan. Simple, clean, done. Then his cum lit up, not with one signal. With 50 ships dropped out of FTL all around him. Large ships. Very large ships. Black holes with long lines of cold blue light running along their sides. Vael warships. Not salvagers. Not patrol ships. Warships. The kind that carried enough firepower to turn his little vessel into a warm cloud of debris in about 3 seconds. Every single one of them had their weapons hot. His scanner showed targeting locks. All of them pointed at him. He counted 17 ships before he stopped counting. The cum crackled. The voice that came through it was not young. It was not warm. It was the kind of voice that had been giving orders for so long that being obeyed was simply a fact of the universe to it. Like gravity, it said something in Vael first. Then it switched to a language his translator could handle. You hold the heir of the eternal throne. Identify yourself human. Before we decide whether to thank you or erase you, Marcus looked at the gray blanket on his medical table. At the small shape under it, breathing slowly. At the faint blue light pressing through the fabric like a nightlight left on in a quiet room, he looked at 17 warships with their weapons pointed at him. He pressed the come button. My name is Marcus Vael, he said. I found the child alive and I kept it that way. That is all I did. Do what you need to do. He let go of the button and waited. Outside, the window, the 17 warships held their position and said nothing. And the stars were very still, and the only sound on his ship was the quiet, steady breathing of a child who was alive because one man could not do the math that said leaving was the right answer. They did not erase him. They escorted him. 6 warships on each side, and 4 behind, and 1 in front, and Marcus flew his small salvage ship in the middle of that formation like a piece of grit caught between someone's fingers. No one spoke to him during the journey. No one answered when he asked where they were going. The formation just moved and he moved with it because the alternative was not really an alternative at all. It took 31 hours to reach Vael Prime. Marcus had seen pictures of it in old survey files. The pictures were not enough. No picture could have been enough. The planet filled his cockpit window like something from a dream. The oceans were black, and they moved very slowly, and the light hit them in a way that made them look like they were made of glass. The forests were everywhere, and they were not green. They were deep blue and dark purple, and they pulsed with soft light from the ground up through every branch and every leaf, so that the whole planet from orbit looked like it was breathing, like it was alive in the way that meant something more than just biology. The city was carved into a mountain, not built against it, not built on top of it. Carved into it the way you carve a word into stone when you want it to last forever. Towers and arches and long bridges running between levels, and all of it made from the same black rock of the mountain itself, so that the city and the mountain were one thing. Had always been one thing. Marcus landed where they told him to land. Then he carried the child off the ship, because the child was still weak, and the child would not let go of his sleeve anyway, and he was not going to pull away from a hurt child just because several thousand armed soldiers were watching. The Heir woke up fully during the landing. His eyes were silver and very clear, and he looked at Marcus for a long time, and then he said something in the Vael that the translator turned into a single word. Stayed. Marcus did not know what to do with that, so he just nodded and kept walking. They brought him through corridors that were impossibly tall. The walls had writing on them in a language so old it did not look like writing anymore. It looked like the wall had grown that way. Vael soldiers stood at every doorway, and they were tall and still, and they watched Marcus with expressions he could not read, and he watched them back because he had learned long ago that the thing looking at you deserved your attention. The throne room was at the center of the mountain. It was not decorated the way human throne rooms were decorated. There were no banners, no gold, no light fixtures or chandeliers. The room was lit by something in the walls themselves, the same slow pulse as the forests outside, as the child's skin, as if the whole planet ran on the same quiet power, and this room was the heart of it. The throne was a single piece of black rock that had not been shaped. It had just been left as it was. And sitting in it was the queen. Ethis Veln had ruled for 6,000 years. Marcus knew this from the same survey files that had given him the pictures of the planet that were not enough. 6,000 years. His entire species had not existed in its current form for 6,000 years. She looked at him now, and he understood immediately that the number was not a fact. It was something you felt in your chest when her eyes found you. She was not large. She was not dressed in anything that looked like power. She wore dark gray, and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was completely still and completely quiet. But the room changed when she looked at you. The room got smaller. Not in a threatening way. In the way a room gets smaller when the most important thing in it finally decides. You're worth noticing. The child left Marcus's, sighed and went to her, and she placed one hand on his head, and she looked at him for a long time, with an expression that was the first expression Marcus had been able to read on any Valtheri face since he arrived. She was relieved. She had been afraid, and now she was not, and that fear had been very large. Then she looked back at Marcus's toward her. Her generals spoke first. They stood to her left, and there were 4 of them, and they all had the same opinion, dressed in different words. The human was a security risk. He had seen the heir's face during a moment of imperial vulnerability. He knew the warship's location. He knew the heir had been alone and unprotected. He had to be removed. Not killed necessarily, but removed. Paid and sent away, and quietly kept quiet. The advisors spoke after. There were 6 of them. They argued about what the correct diplomatic price was. One suggested a trade contract. One suggested territory rights in the outer corridor. One suggested a generous sum in Valtheri credit. They spoke about Marcus the way people speak about a bill that needs to be settled. Not unkindly, just practically. Marcus stood in the middle of all this and said nothing. He had been in rooms full of people deciding things about him before. He knew how to wait. Then the queen raised one finger. Just one finger lifted slightly from her folded hands, and the room went silent the way rooms go silent. When silence is not a request but a fact, she looked at Marcus, and she spoke in his language, not through a translator. In his language, slow and correct and chosen carefully. "What do you want?" she said. Marcus thought about it. For exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long. Nothing, he said. The child was alive. I kept it that way. I do not need anything for that. The silence after that was different from the silence before it. The first silence had been obedience. This one was something else. This one was the whole room not knowing what to do with a sentence it had never heard before. One of the generals made a sound, a short sound, like something small breaking. The advisors looked at each other. Marcus watched them. He watched the way they searched each other's faces for a framework that was not there. He watched them come up empty. He watched the queen watch all of them come up empty, and he watched something move behind her silver eyes that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. The Valtheri built everything on debt. He had read enough to know that. Their laws, their politics, their families, their wars. Everything was structured around what was owed and what was given and what was taken, and the correct ceremony around each. An act with no debt attached to it was not a concept their civilization had a word for. He had not done it to confuse them. He had just told them the truth. But the truth had landed in that room like a stone. Dropped into still water, and the ripples were going to reach the edges. The queen was quiet for a long time. The heir sat beside her throne and watched. Marcus with those clear silver eyes and did not look away. Finally, the queen spoke again. One sentence. "Stay here for 30 days, she said. Then I will decide what is owed." It was not a question. Marcus nodded anyway because it was the right thing to do. He was given rooms that were too large and too quiet. And that night, he sat by a window that looked out over the black ocean and the breathing forest, and he thought about nothing in particular. He was not afraid. He was not excited. He had done a thing because it needed doing, and now he was in a palace that was a mountain, on a planet that was alive, and somewhere down the hall, a child was sleeping safely who had not been sleeping safely 2 days ago. He decided that was enough to be at peace with. Outside the window, the forest pulsed its slow blue light into the dark, and the ocean moved like black glass, and 6,000 years of empire held its breath and waited to see what one ordinary man would do next. Nobody told Marcus he was being tested. That was the point. On the second morning, he woke up early, the way he always woke up early, and he walked the corridors, because sitting still in large rooms had never agreed with him. The palace was already moving. Servants and workers and low-ranked officials moving through the halls with the quiet efficiency of people who had been doing the same things in the same building for generations. They did not speak to him. They did not ignore him either. They moved around him the way water moves around a rock, aware of him, adjusting, not engaging. He found the kitchens by following the smell. He asked for something to eat, using hand gestures because his Valtheri was non-existent, and the kitchen workers laughed at his gestures in a way that was not mean, and someone brought him a plate of things that were mostly edible, and he ate and said thank you with the one Valthari word he had already figured out, and the woman who had brought the food looked at him for a moment like she was deciding something, and then she smiled and went back to work. 2 floors below the kitchens, he found a maintenance corridor with a water recycler that was making a sound it should not have been making, a low grinding cycle that repeated every 40 seconds. He stood there listening to it for a moment, and then he went back to his rooms and got his kit, and came back and opened the panel and fixed it. It took 20 minutes, a worn coupling and a filter that needed replacing. Simple work. He closed the panel and left. He did not know that the servant whose quarters that recycler supplied had been asking for it to be repaired for 3 weeks. He did not know that she stood in the corridor behind him the entire time watching him work with Anne, an expression that her supervisor would later spend considerable time trying to describe in a report to the Queen's intelligence office. He did not know about the report. He did not know about any of the reports. The palace guards trained in a courtyard on the east side of the mountain every morning. On the 4th day, Marcus stopped to watch. On the 5th day, one of them gestured at him in a way that was clearly an invitation to join. He accepted. He fought their style and lost cleanly, and then lost again, and on the 3rd match, started adapting, and he won, and he did not celebrate. He just bowed his head slightly the way he had seen them do, and asked with gestures if they wanted another round, and they did, and for an hour they just fought, and it was good work, and no one said anything. That needed saying because the work said it. The guard commander filed a report that evening. The human learns fast. The human does not show off. When he wins, he acts as if it is information, not achievement. We do not have a category for this. On the 7th day, Prince Vael found him in the archive. Marcus had wandered in by accident looking for something to read, and stayed because the archive was enormous and old and smelled of something that reminded him of old paper, even though nothing in it was made of paper. He was sitting at a low table looking at star charts he could not read when Vael sat down across from him. The boy was better. His arm was properly set now by the palace healers, and the light patterns on his skin were bright and quick. He looked at the star charts Marcus was holding, and then he took them and spread them on the table and pointed to a star and said its name in Valthari. Marcus repeated it. Badly, Vael corrected him. Marcus repeated it again. Better. They spent 3 hours in the archive. Cale taught him words. Marcus listened and repeated and asked questions by pointing at things, and Cale answered and sometimes corrected him and sometimes laughed and laughed. Marcus did not mind being laughed at when it was that kind of laugh. The kind that meant you are trying, and that is a good thing, even when you are failing. On the 9th day, Cale asked him about Earth. Marcus talked for a long time. He talked about the wars. Not proudly. Not with shame either. Just as facts. Humans had hurt each other badly and often, and for reasons that made less sense the further away from them you got. But they had also rebuilt. Every time. Sometimes they rebuilt better. Sometimes they just rebuilt the same thing and broke it again. But they had never stopped. There was something in them that did not know how to stop, and it was the same thing that made them destructive, and the same thing that made them survive. Cale listened to all of it with complete attention. Then he asked one question. Why do you keep going if it is so hard? Marcus thought. It's about that for a while. Because the next thing might be worth it, he said. And because the people standing next to you need you too. Cale was quiet after that. His light patterns moved slowly on his arms and hands. Thinking patterns Marcus had started to recognize. Meanwhile, in other rooms, people were reading the reports. The generals had changed their position twice. First they said the human was a low risk. Then they said he was an unknown variable, which was more dangerous than a low risk. Then they said he was something they did not have tactical language for, and that the absence of tactical language was itself a concerning finding. Their final report to the Queen was 3 pages long, and its conclusion was one sentence. We cannot predict him because he does not want anything we know how to offer. The lead advisor filed a separate report. It said that in 40 years of watching people in the palace, the human was the only person she had ever observed who behaved exactly the same whether or not he thought he was being observed. There was no performance, no posturing, no calculating. He simply moved through the world. The way he moved through the world and the world's opinion of it did not appear to adjust his course. She noted this was either very dangerous or very rare. She noted she thought it was very rare. The Queen read every report. She read them at night after the palace was quiet and the only light in her room was the slow pulse of the mountain itself coming through the walls. 6,000 years had given her a very particular skill. She could look at a person and see not just what they were, but what they would become under pressure. Under temptation. Under loss. She had looked at Marcus's Vael on the first day, and she had seen something she had not seen in a very long time. She had seen a man who was the same all the way through. No hidden layers. No secret agenda folded underneath the surface. What he showed the world was what he was. That kind of person was rarer than any metal or any gem or any military technology in the known galaxy. She had met perhaps 4 people like that in 6,000 years. 2 of them had been Valtheri. One had been from a species that no longer existed. One had been nobody. A salvager. An unremarkable human who fixed recyclers and lost gracefully and taught. Wounded prince that sometimes you keep going. Because the person next to you needs you. 2. On the 29th night, she sat alone in her throne room and she made her decision. She did not make it for political reasons. She did not make it for diplomatic leverage or military strategy. Other rulers would use it for those things. That was fine. That was their business. She made it because a debt was real, and it had to be honored in the only way that was equal to what it was it, and because the galaxy had too few people in it who were the same all the way through it was going to need more of them. Tomorrow, she would show it one. The 30th morning came in cold and blue. Marcus woke before the light changed, and he sat on the edge of his bed in the too large room, and he looked at his hands for a while, the way he sometimes did when he was thinking. Old hands, scarred across the knuckles, a burn mark on the left palm from a job 2 years ago that had gone sideways. They were not remarkable hands. They were just the hands he had. A servant came at first light and told him to dress well. He had one clean set of clothing that was not a work suit. dark gray trousers and a dark blue shirt that he had bought on a station 3 months ago and had barely worn. He put them on and looked at himself in the long mirror on the wall and decided it would have to do. He was escorted to the throne room by 6 guards. The same route he had walked on the first day. The same tall corridors with the writing that looked like it had grown into the walls. But today, the corridors were not empty. They were full. Every lord, every military commander, every regional governor and fleet admiral and senior advisor in the Valthari Empire had been called to the capital. They stood in rows along the corridor walls, and they watched him pass, and their faces were the unreadable Valthari expressions that Marcus had mostly learned to see through, but right. Now they were all fully closed, and he could not read a single one. He walked the whole length of that corridor with hundreds of eyes on him, and he kept his pace steady and his back straight and his hands loose at his sides because there was nothing else to do. The throne. The room was different from the last time. The last time, it had been him and the queen and her court. Today it was filled from wall to wall with people standing in perfect silence. The pulse in the walls was brighter than he had seen it before, faster, as if the mountain itself knew today was important, and every diplomatic feed in the known galaxy was open. He did not know that at first. He found out later that the Queen had opened a broadcast channel to every empire, every alliance, and every neutral state in the galaxy 2 hours before dawn. That by the time Marcus walked into that room there were approximately 11 billion people on various worlds watching what was about to happen. He just walked in and stood where he had stood before and waited. The Queen was on her throne, still hands folded, silver eyes already on him. The room was perfectly quiet. Then she stood up. Marcus did not know the history. He found that out later too. He did not know that in 6,000 years of rule, Queen Ethis Veln had never stood from the eternal throne for any person or any event. Not for treaties. Not for the deaths of kings. Not for the arrival of enemies or the victory of wars. The throne was where she received the world because the world came to her, and that was the order of things. She stood, and the room made a sound. Not words. A sound. Like the air itself was surprised. She walked to him, slowly. Not because she was old in the way. Bodies get old. But because each step was deliberate. Each step was a statement. She walked across the full length of the throne room floor, and everyone in that room, and everyone watching on 11 billion screens, watched her walk toward one man in dark gray trousers and a blue shirt who stood very still and did not fully understand what was happening. She stopped in front of him. She was slightly shorter than him. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and there was a moment between them that had no words in it. Just two people standing very close in a very large room full of very important silence. Then she reached into the folds of her gray clothing, and she took out a cord. It was thin, dark, with small points of light along it that moved slowly the way the light moved in the palace walls. It looked simple. It looked like nothing. Marcus would later learn that the last time that cord had been brought out was 4,000 years ago. That it had been made on the day the empire was founded. That there was only one. She spoke to the room first. Her voice carried without being raised because it was the voice of someone who had never needed to raise. She spoke for a long time in Balthari, and then she turned back to Marcus, and she spoke in his language so he would understand every word, and so that every translator on every world receiving the feed would carry it. Clearly, she said, this man entered a burning ship alone. She said he had no orders and no contract and no reason except that a life was there and needed keeping. She said he asked for nothing. She said he fixed a recycler and a servant's hall and fought her guards honestly and sat with her son in an old archive and taught him that you keep going. Because the person next to you needs you too, she said the Valthari Empire owed a debt. Then she said the debt could only be paid one way. She held up the cord, and she said the words of the oath of kin, and her voice did not shake, and it did not speed up, and it did not slow down. It was the most serious thing Marcus had ever heard spoken in his life, and he had heard serious things spoken. When she finished, Marcus opened his mouth to say it was too much, to say he did not need this. To say he was just a salvager in this was a very large gesture for a thing that had been simple. She stopped him with one look, not a harsh look, just a look that was very clear. The look of someone who had considered every word they were about to say for 30 days and was finished considering. She said one thing, "You told me anyone would have done it. That is why it cannot be declined." The world does not give the oath to the remarkable. It gives it to the ones who do not know they are. Marcus closed his mouth. Then Prince Vael came forward from beside the throne. He was carrying the cord now. His small, serious face was set with an expression Marcus recognized, because he had seen it when Vael was learning new words in the archive. The expression of someone doing something important and doing it carefully. Vael took Marcus's left hand. He tied the cord around his wrist. His fingers were careful and precise, and he did not look up until the knot was done. And then he looked up, and his silver eyes were very bright, and he said one word in Marcus's language. "Stayed," he said. "You stayed." Marcus looked at the cord on his wrist, at the small moving lights along it. He thought about a gray blanket and a child breathing under it, and 17 warships in the dark. He thought about how the math had been simple, not easy, but simple. He nodded at Vael, and he did not trust his voice quite enough to use it. The room erupted, not in noise the way human rooms erupted. In movement, every person in that throne room pressed one hand to their chest and lowered their head in the Valthari gesture of formal acknowledgement, floor by floor, row by row, like a wave moving through the mountain. The sound of it was thousands of hands moving, at once and thousands of heads bowing, and it was the quietest and most enormous thing Marcus had ever been in the middle of. On 11 billion screens across the galaxy, the broadcast was still going in the war rooms and diplomatic chambers. Of 3 rival empire staffers were already pulling up the Valthari Oath of Kin texts, reading the clauses, reading them again, running them through legal interpretation systems, and slowly understanding that the Queen had not just honored a debt, she had redrawn a map. Every Valthari ship in the galaxy owed Marcus Vael an answer to a distress call. Every Valthari port owed him entry. Every hand raised against him was raised against the Empire, and the Empire would respond accordingly. But there was another clause, buried deep in a founding document 4,000 years old, a clause about the Oathkin's people of origin, the civilization that had shaped them. That clause was there because the Valthari understood that a person was not made alone. They were made by everything that raised them. The staffers read it once, then read it again. Then somebody in a war room on a rival world said something, quietly, and everybody else in the room went very still. The Queen had not just given a gift to one man. She had given it to the species that made him. Marcus did not know any of that yet. He was still standing in the throne room with a cord on his wrist and a child's hand in his, and the slow pulse of the mountain all around him. But outside in the dark between the stars, the galaxy was already changing shape, and it would never change back. The galaxy did not change quietly. It changed the way things change when a stone lands in still water, fast at the center, slower at the edges, but reaching everything eventually. By the morning after the ceremony, the 3 rival empires had each sent emergency messages to their ambassadors on Valthari Prime. The ambassadors sent back the same answer in different words. The ceremony was real. The oath was valid. The cord had been tied by the heir's own hands. There was nothing to contest and nothing to negotiate. This was done in the Kethali Dominion. A senior general called an emergency council session and stood at the head of the table and told 11 other generals that their entire military projection model for the human territories needed to be rewritten. Every corridor, every patrol route, every contingency plan that had factored in human vulnerability as a strategic variable. All of it rewritten because a human now walked under Valthari protection, not a human government, not a human fleet or a human alliance. A single human man. Which meant the math was even stranger than if it had been official. If a single man could carry that protection, then the protection was not about politics. It was about something else. Something the general did not have a word for in her language and was deeply uncomfortable about not having a word for. In the Sarati Collective, 7 legal scholars spent 4 days reading the Oath of Kin, founding documents, and specifically the clause about the Oath Kin's people of origin. On the 4th day, the youngest scholar sat back from her screen and said it very plainly. She said that by Valthari law Marcus Vael's people of origin was the human species, and that the clause applied full protections of the oath to his people of origin, which meant any act of military aggression against human colonies, human ships, or human populations was now legally indistinguishable from an act of aggression against the Valthari Empire. The senior scholar asked her to run the interpretation again. She ran it 3 more times. Same answer every time. The room was quiet for a long time after that. On Earth, the Interstellar Council had been watching the broadcast from the beginning. When the cord was tied, they had continued watching in silence. When the legal implications started arriving from their own diplomatic offices, the council chamber did not explode into argument, the way it usually did when something large and unexpected landed in front of it. It went quiet instead. A very specific kind of quiet. It's a kind that happens when people are feeling something they do not yet have the right words for. The council chair. It's a small, tired woman named Priya Asay, who had been doing this job for 11 years and who had spent most of those 11 years carefully navigating the fact that humanity was a young species in a very old galaxy, and young species did not get to take up too much space or make too much noise until they had earned the right. She had spent 11 years being careful, being small, being patient. She looked at the broadcast footage of one man, standing in a mountain palace, with a cord on his wrist and a child's hand in his. Then she drafted a message. She wrote it herself. She did not ask her communications team to review it. She did not send it through diplomatic channels. She opened a public broadcast and she read it aloud, and it went out to every world that had been watching. She said this: Marcus, Vael speaks for no one but himself. He does not carry our flag. He was not sent by us. He does not represent a policy or a program or a plan. He is one man who could not leave a child alone in the dark. We did not make him do that. We did not teach him that specific thing on that specific day. Whatever he is, he became it on his own. She paused. Then she said the last part. But we are proud of him anyway. And we hope he knows that wherever he goes, whatever he does, there is a whole world behind him even. When it is very far away, the message reached Marcus 3 weeks later. He was already back on the dogged Persistence. He had said goodbye to Kale on the landing platform, and Kale had stood very straight and formal and then, at the last second, had grabbed Marcus's arm with both hands and pressed his forehead against Marcus's shoulder, the way young Valthari did with family. And Marcus had stood there for a moment, and then put his hand on the back of the boy's head, and that was that. He had shaken the queen's hand. She had let him. It was not a Valthari gesture, but she received it without a stiffness, and she held his hand for a moment longer than a handshake required, and she looked at him with her 6,000-year eyes. And she said something he would carry for the rest of his life. She said the galaxy is old and very tired, Marcus Vael. It is good to be reminded that simple things are still possible. Then she let go. He flew out of Valthari space with a small navigation upgrade that Kale had absolutely insisted on installing on the Persistence. It made the FTL calculation 17% faster. Marcus had tried to refuse it, and Kale had looked at him with the specific expression of a child who will not be argued with, and Marcus had let the engineers install it. He was 3 weeks out when Priya Asay's message found him. He read it once, sitting in the cockpit with a cup of something hot and the stars very still outside the window. Then he read it again. Then he set it down on the console, and he looked out at the dark for a while. He was not a man who cried easily. He was not a man who cried at all most of the time. There was something about reading that message alone, in a small ship very far from home, that got past the part of him that was used to being alone, and reached something older and quieter underneath. He sat with it for a long time. Then he picked up the message again, and he wrote back. One line. He sent it to the council address, and he did not know if it would reach Priya, say specifically, or just some communications office somewhere. It did not matter. He wrote, I know. I always did. He set the line for the outer fringe and let the persistence move. The weeks that followed were ordinary. To salvage jobs. One hull repair on a dead freighter. One search and rescue call from a mining platform that turned out to be a busted sensor and not an emergency at all. Normal work, quiet work. It's a kind of work that did not get put in history books. But 3 times in those weeks, a Vael patrol ship passed near his location and slowed as it passed. Not stopping, not hailing, just slowing for a moment. Way you slow when you pass something you are keeping an eye on. And once, a Vael courier ship with the Amitsa Queen seal on its hull pulled alongside the Persistence at a relay station, and the pilot leaned out of her cockpit and raised one hand in the Vael salute, and Marcus raised his hand back, and that was the whole of it. He was not alone out here anymore. He had not asked for that. He was not sure he needed it. But there was something in those moments of a ship slowing as it passed him in the dark that sat warm and steady in his chest, the way things sit when they are real and not imagined. The cord was still on his wrist. He had not taken it off. Did not plan to. The lights in it moved slowly in the dark of the cockpit, the same slow pulse as the palace walls. As Kale's skin when he was sleeping, as the whole breathing living planet that was the oldest empire in the galaxy. Moving gently now on the wrist of a scarred, unremarkable man in a small ship, who was looking for the next thing that needed to be picked up or fixed or saved. There was always a next thing. That was the truth he had. It's always operated on, not hope exactly. Not optimism. Just the simple, practical belief that the next moment was worth showing up for. That the person standing next to you mattered. If something was alive and it needed help, then you helped it and you did not calculate the cost. First, and you did not ask what you would get for it, and you did not wait to see if someone more qualified was on the way. You just went in. The stars were very still outside the window. Somewhere out in that dark, the oldest empire in the galaxy had one standing order attached to his ship's transponder signal. Standing order that had never existed before him and would not exist after if it was ever lifted, and all it said was 4 words. If he calls answer. Marcus Vael flew on into the dark, and the cord on his wrist moved its quiet light in the galaxy. Behind him was never going to be quite the same shape again, and he did not know. The full size of what he had started, and probably would not have cared very much if he had. There was a signal on his scanner. Faint. Far. Something at the edge of the corridor. He leaned forward and checked it. Something alive, barely. But there he set the course, and the Persistence moved toward it without hesitation, and the stars streamed. Past the window like they always had, like they always would, and Marcus Vael went to see what needed saving next. Some people were just built that way. The galaxy was lucky one of them was human.